The scent of shame was a bitter thing, like burnt roots and cold ash. Calla knew it better than her own name. It clung to the threadbare wool of her tunic and settled in the hollows of her bones. Here, at the edge of the Sunstone Pack, worth was measured in the strength of your wolf, the sharpness of your claws, and the ferocity of your spirit. Calla had none of these. She was wolfless, a flaw in the bloodline, a walking embodiment of her family's fall from grace generations ago. Her only gift was a curse in this land of warriors. She was a scent weaver. She could smell emotion, the cloying sweetness of false praise, the sharp metallic tang of fear, the deep, earthy musk of loyalty. More than that, she could subtly manipulate them, weaving whispers of calm into a storm of rage or a thread of hope into the fabric of despair. It was a useless, passive magic in a world that roared. Today, the air was thick with a collective anxiety that tasted like ozone before a storm. The entire pack was gathered in the main clearing, their postures stiff, their faces grim. The tribute was due. Every 5 years, a new offering had to be sent to the Frost King's court in the north, a gesture of fealty to the Alpha of Alphas, King Alaric, who ruled from his icy fortress in the heart of a perpetual winter. Her sister Sarah stood beside her. Sarah was everything Calla was not. Tall, strong, her inner wolf a blazing furnace of power that Calla could feel even from a few feet away. The scent of pride and strength rolled off her in waves, a stark contrast to Calla's own faint aroma of wilting herbs and dust. "Keep your head down," Sarah murmured, her voice a low growl of protection. "Don't let them see you." But it was too late. Alpha Marcus, his face a mask of grim duty, strode to the center of the clearing. His gaze swept over the assembled wolves, lingering on the strongest warriors, the most promising hunters. The tribute was usually one of their finest, a symbol of the pack's might. Then his eyes, cold and calculating, landed on Calla. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The scent of their pity and scorn was a physical blow. She flinched, instinctively trying to make herself smaller. "We send a tribute to honor the Frost King," Alpha Marcus boomed, his voice echoing off the ancient stones that circled the clearing, "to show our unwavering loyalty." But loyalty can be shown in many ways, not just through strength of arms, but through uniqueness. His gaze remained locked on her. Calla's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. The metallic scent of her own fear filled her nostrils. "Calla of the fallen house of Cygnus," he declared, and the name of her disgraced ancestors was a fresh wound. "You will be our tribute to King Alaric. Your peculiar talents may be of service to a king who lives in a land without scent." It was a death sentence disguised as an honor. The Frost King's court was a legend, a place of cold, silent dread. The king himself was a phantom, a ruthless ruler shrouded in a magical mist that was said to dull the senses and chill the soul. No tribute had ever returned. They were sent, and they were forgotten. Sarah let out a choked gasp, stepping forward. "Alpha, no, she won't survive it." "My decision is final," Marcus snapped, his authority a crushing weight. He turned his attention back to Calla, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "You are wolfless, barren, of no use to this pack. Perhaps the Frost King will find a purpose for you, or perhaps he will discard you. Either way, your family's debt to this pack will be paid." The world narrowed to a pinprick of icy terror. She was being sent away, not as an offering, but as refuse. A piece of trash to be thrown away in the hopes it might appease a distant, fearsome god. The scent of shame was no longer a whisper. It was a suffocating shroud, and it tasted like goodbye. The journey north was a blur of gray skies and biting winds. Calla traveled with 2 of Alpha Marcus's guards, stoic wolves who spoke only to give orders. They smelled of grim resolve and a faint, underlying pity they tried to conceal. They knew, as she did, that they were escorting her to her end. They treated her like a ghost already, a specter haunting the space between them. As they traveled deeper into the Frost King's domain, the world began to change. The vibrant scents of the forest, damp earth, pine needles, living things, faded away, replaced by a sterile, chilling emptiness. It was as if the color had been bled from the air itself. A strange, unnatural mist coiled around the skeletal trees, clinging to the ground like a shroud. This was the king's mist, the stuff of legends. Kala's gift, which had been a constant barrage of sensory information her entire life, was now starved. The silence in her scent palette was more deafening than any sound. It left her feeling hollowed out, adrift in a sea of nothingness. The guards, their powerful shifter senses dulled, grew more tense, their hands never straying far from the hilts of their swords. After weeks of travel, they saw it. A jagged shard of black rock and ice tearing a hole in the sky. The fortress of King Alaric. It was not a castle. It was a wound in the landscape, stark and forbidding. The mist was thickest here, swirling around the towers like tormented spirits. There was no scent of life, no smoke from chimneys, no smell of food or beast. Only the cold, clean scent of ice and ancient stone. They were met at the gates by a figure cloaked in gray furs. He was tall and lean, his face harsh, but his eyes held a flicker of weary intelligence. The scent that clung to him was faint but sharp, like winter air and tempered steel. Duty. Unyielding and absolute. "I am Ronan, beta to the king," he said, his voice flat and devoid of warmth. His gaze passed over the Sunstone guards and settled on Kala. There was no curiosity, no pity, only a dispassionate assessment. The tribute. It wasn't a question. "She is Kala," one of her guards said, his voice rough. "She has a unique skill." Ronan's lip twitched, a minuscule movement that might have been a sneer. "The king will be the judge of that. Your duty is done. Leave." Her guards didn't hesitate. They gave her one last look, a flicker of something that might have been regret, and turned, their footsteps swallowed by the mist. Kala was alone, a tiny, fragile thing before the immense, silent fortress. The great iron-banded doors groaned open, revealing a hall that seemed carved from a glacier. The air inside was even colder, a deep, penetrating chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the cold of absence, an absence of life, of warmth, of hope. "The king does not grant audiences to tributes upon arrival," Ronan stated, his voice echoing in the vast emptiness. "You will be quartered. You will be given tasks. If you prove useful, you may survive. If not..." He left the sentence unfinished. He didn't need to complete it. The silence of the castle spoke for him. He led her through endless corridors of polished black stone that reflected the ghostly light filtering through high, narrow windows. There were no tapestries, no decorations, no sign that anyone truly lived here. It was a tomb. Finally, they stopped before a simple wooden door. "Your chambers? Your duties will be brought to you in the morning. Do not wander." He turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the oppressive silence. Kala pushed the door open. The room was small, Spartan, containing only a narrow bed, a small table, and a single candle. It was cleaner than her hovel back home, but infinitely more lonely. She sat on the edge of the hard mattress, the profound sensory deprivation pressing in on her. For the first time, she truly understood the horror of this place. It wasn't just cold, it was empty, a void. And in the center of this void sat the Frost King, a man whose reputation was as cold and empty as his kingdom. A man who devoured tributes and was never seen. She closed her eyes and tried to weave a scent of comfort for herself, a memory of her sister's warm, steady presence. But nothing happened. The mist even smothered her own small magic. Here, in the heart of the frost, she was truly, utterly powerless. Days bled into one another, each one a mirror of the last. Kala's duties were menial and isolating. She polished silver that was never used, dusted furniture in rooms that were never entered, and swept stone floors that were never dirtied. She saw no one but the silent, gray-clad servants who moved like wraiths through the halls, their faces blank, their scents muted to a faint whisper of old sorrows. The castle was a place of profound sensory nullification. The pervasive mist seeped through stone walls, its chilling touch suppressing every smell, every emotion, every flicker of life. For Kala, it was a unique form of torture. She felt like a part of herself had been amputated, leaving a phantom limb that ached for the input it could no longer receive. She learned about the king through whispers and fearful glances. King Alaric, the Frost King. He remained in the highest tower, a recluse no one but his beta, Ronan, ever saw. They said the mist was his creation, a shield of sorrow and rage that kept the world at bay. They said he was cursed, his heart frozen solid in his chest. They said he was a monster. Kala didn't know what to believe, but the crushing emptiness of his castle was evidence enough of a deep and terrible wound. This wasn't the home of a tyrant who reveled in power. It was the prison of a man in immense pain. One evening, driven by a desperate need to feel something, anything, she disobeyed Ronan's order. She wandered. She crept through the silent corridors, her soft shoes making no sound on the polished stone. She was drawn upward, toward the source of the cold, toward the king's tower. The higher she climbed, the more intense the chill became. The mist grew thicker, coiling like a living thing. A heavy, ornate door of black wood barred her way at the top of the final staircase. The air here was different. Through the suffocating blanket of the mist, she could feel a sliver of something else. A scent so faint it was barely there, but it was the first real thing she had smelled in weeks. It was the scent of agonizing loneliness, not the simple sadness of being alone, but a vast cosmic solitude, the desolation of a star dying in an empty universe. It was cold and sharp, like shattered glass. Her hand trembled as she reached out, her fingers brushing against the cold wood of the door. She had no right to be here. If she were caught, she would be killed. But that scent, it was a call from a soul in torment, and her own broken soul couldn't help but answer. The door swung inward without a sound. The room beyond was vast and circular, its walls lined with shelves of books that were covered in a thin layer of frost. In the center of the room, seated in a high-backed throne-like chair facing a massive ice-rimmed window, was a man. He was a silhouette against the ghostly twilight filtering through the mist. Large, powerfully built, with a mane of dark hair that fell over his shoulders. He did not move. He did not seem to breathe. He was as still and silent as the statues in the lower halls. This was him, the Frost King. Fear, sharp and immediate, pierced through her curiosity. She should run. She should flee back to her room and pray she was not discovered. But then he spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very stones of the floor. It was not angry. It was weary, heavy with a sorrow that resonated with the scent of his loneliness. "You are the new tribute," he said, not turning. "The one with the peculiar talent." Kala froze, her blood turning to ice. He knew. He had known she was there the entire time. My lord," she stammered, her voice a pathetic whisper. He finally turned his head, and for the first time she saw his face. It was a masterpiece of harsh, beautiful lines, a strong jaw, A straight nose, a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. But his eyes were the color of a frozen sky, and in their depths was a storm of pain so profound it stole her breath. He was not a monster. He was a man drowning. "They sent me a scent weaver," he said, a bitter, humorless smile touching his lips, "to a kingdom that has no scent." The irony is exquisite. His gaze locked onto hers, and in that moment, the power imbalance was absolute. He was a king, an alpha of alphas, a being of immense, terrifying power. She was a wolfless omega, a discarded tribute. Yet, looking into his desolate eyes, Calla felt not just fear but a strange, aching pang of empathy. "Perhaps," she heard herself say, her voice shaking but clear, "they sent you the one thing that might matter in a world of nothingness. A memory of what was lost." Silence descended thick and heavy. His frozen eyes widened almost imperceptibly. No one had dared to speak to him with such boldness in centuries. He saw not a cowering tribute, but a flicker of defiance, a spark of warmth in his unending winter. For the first time in a very long time, King Alaric felt something other than the cold. He felt curiosity. Alaric watched the small female. She stood before him, trembling, yet her gaze was direct. Her scent, which should have been completely smothered by the mist, was a faint, stubborn whisper of dried chamomile and courage. It was the first distinct scent he had registered in years, and it was like hearing a single note of music after a lifetime of silence. His curse, the ever-present mist, was a part of him. It was born of the grief and rage from a betrayal long ago, and it had grown into this monstrous, sentient cold that mirrored his own frozen heart. It smothered everything: scent, emotion, connection. It had made him a king in a kingdom of ghosts, isolated on a throne of ice. And this wolfless omega, this broken tribute sent as a cruel joke, spoke to him of memory. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice still a low rumble. "Calla, my lord." "Calla," he repeated, the name feeling strange on his tongue. "You are not afraid of me." "I am terrified of you, my lord," she admitted, her honesty a startling contrast to the cloying fear and false deference he usually received. "But your loneliness is louder than my fear." The statement struck him with the force of a physical blow. She could smell it. She could smell the truth of him, the secret agony he had hidden from the world for centuries. This peculiar talent of hers was not the parlor trick he had imagined. It was a key, and it was being held by the most insignificant creature in his entire kingdom. A dangerous, unfamiliar emotion stirred within him. Hope. It was a fragile, painful thing. "Ronan confines you to the lower levels," he stated, a test. "Yes, my lord." "From now on, you will perform your duties here. In this room." A flicker of panic crossed her face, quickly suppressed. To be confined with him, the source of the terrifying cold, was a terrifying prospect. But it was a command, not a request. She gave a short, jerky nod. And so began their strange, silent ritual. Calla would arrive each morning as the gray light filtered through the frosted window. She would dust his untouched books, polish the obsidian floor, and tend to a fire that gave off light, but no discernible heat. She never spoke unless spoken to. Alaric would watch her. He would sit on his throne, a tome open in his lap. But his eyes would follow her small, determined form as she moved through the room. He watched as she began her quiet rebellion against his winter. She couldn't use her scent weaving in the traditional sense. The mist was too powerful. But she found other ways. She would find a single, resilient spider silk and leave it on his desk. Its scent a microscopic whisper of persistence. She would crush a dried leaf she'd found tucked in her pocket from her journey, releasing a momentary phantom scent of autumn and decay, of a world that still turned, of seasons that still changed. They were tiny, insignificant acts, but in Alaric's sterile, scentless world, they were explosions of sensation. He found himself anticipating them, this tiny daily reminder that a world existed beyond his self-imposed prison. One day, he found her staring at the massive, frost-covered window. "What do you see?" he asked, his voice startling her. "I see the memory of a son," she answered softly, not looking at him. "It's faint, but it's there." Under all the ice, he rose from his throne, the movement fluid and silent for a man of his size, and came to stand beside her. He was a mountain of shadow and power, and she had to crane her neck to look at him. Up close, the scent of his solitude was overwhelming, a physical weight that made her want to weep. "There has been no sun here for 200 years, he said, his voice laced with a bitterness so profound it was almost a physical taste. "That doesn't mean it's not there," she insisted, her gaze fixed on the window. "It's just forgotten." Without thinking, she focused all her will, all the meager dregs of her power, not on creating a scent, but on enhancing one that already existed. She reached for the smell of his loneliness and tried to weave into it a single thread of warmth, a memory of a sunbeam she had felt on her face as a child. For a fleeting, impossible second, a tiny patch of the frost on the windowpane melted. A single perfect drop of water trickled down the glass. Alaric stared at it, his frozen eyes wide with shock. He looked down at Calla, who was pale and swaying, the effort having drained her completely. He reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder, an instinct to steady her warring with a lifetime of untouchable isolation. The moment was shattered by the heavy tread of footsteps. Ronan appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of iron disapproval. His gaze flickered from the drop of water on the window to Calla's pale face, and then to his king's outstretched hand. "My lord," Ronan said, his voice tight, "your uncle, Lord Borin, has arrived. He demands an audience." The fragile warmth in the room vanished, instantly replaced by a biting cold. Alaric's hand dropped to his side. His expression shuddered, the mask of the Frost King slamming back into place. "Send him in," Alaric commanded, his voice once again the flat, dead thing it had always been. He turned his back on Calla and the melted drop of water, striding back to his throne. The moment of connection was over, broken by the intrusion of the outside world. And Calla could smell the new scent that clung to the air around her king, the sharp, metallic tang of dread. Lord Borin was a wolf carved from granite and ambition. He was older than Alaric, with a face full of harsh lines and a beard shot through with silver. He carried the scent of the old ways, of blood and dominance, and an unyielding belief in strength above all else. It was a suffocating, arrogant smell, and it set Calla's teeth on edge. He strode into the throne room as if he owned it, his heavy fur-lined cloak sweeping behind him. His eyes, small and sharp, immediately dismissed Calla as nothing more than a piece of furniture before fixing on his nephew. "Alaric," he began, his tone a grating mix of feigned deference and actual command. "The southern lords grow restless. They speak of the unending winter, of a king who hides in his tower while his lands freeze. They question your strength." Alaric remained impassive on his throne, his face a mask of cold indifference. "Let them question. Their lands are sworn to me. Their loyalty is not a matter of weather." "Loyalty is a matter of power," Borin boomed, taking a step closer. "They see weakness. A king who cannot control his own domain, who cannot even take a mate to secure his line. They see the curse winning." At the word curse, the temperature in the room plummeted. A fresh layer of frost bloomed on the window panes, erasing the small patch Calla had cleared. Alaric's knuckles were white where he gripped the arms of his throne, The scent of his pain, sharp and cold, spiked in the air. Boren's gaze slid to Calla again, a cruel, calculating light in his eyes. "And what is this?" "The tribute from Sunstone? I heard they sent you their refuse, a wolfless omega. Is this how you project strength, nephew? By surrounding yourself with the broken and the useless?" Calla flinched, the insult a familiar sting. She tried to fade into the shadows, to become invisible. "She is here at my command." Alaric's voice was dangerously quiet, each word a chip of ice. "Her purpose is not your concern." "Everything in this kingdom is my concern," Boren retorted, his scent turning acrid with frustration. "I held this throne for you while you were a boy, reeling from your father's accident. I have guided this kingdom through its darkest days. I will not stand by and watch you let it crumble into ice and memory because you are too proud to seek a real solution." "And what solution do you propose, Uncle?" Alaric asked, a deadly silkiness to his tone. "A show of force, a political marriage. Lady Genevieve of the Silver Moon Pack has been offered. An alliance with them would silence the dissenters. She is a true alpha female, strong, fertile. She would give you heirs, solidify your rule. She is what this kingdom needs, not—" He gestured dismissively at Calla. "This." The room was suffocatingly tense. Calla felt trapped between two crushing forces. Boren was the embodiment of the world that had rejected her, a world of brutal strength and calculated power. Alaric was something else, a mystery wrapped in pain. "Your counsel is noted, Lord Boren," Alaric said, his voice final. It was a clear dismissal. Boren's jaw tightened. He shot one last venomous look at Calla before turning on his heel. "Do not let your grief make you a fool, Alaric. A frozen heart can be shattered." He swept from the room, leaving a trail of cold fury in his wake. For a long time, the only sound was the faint whisper of the wind outside. Alaric did not move, did not speak. He stared into the distance, his face unreadable, but Calla could smell the turmoil inside him, the raw, open wound of his grief, the bitter taste of his uncle's ambition, and the cold, heavy weight of his duty all swirled together in a silent, agonizing storm. She wanted to say something, to offer some small comfort, but the gulf between them felt wider than ever. He was a king, and his problems were the problems of kingdoms and alliances and ancient curses. She was just a wolfless girl who could smell his sadness. Finally he spoke, his voice rough. "Leave me." It was not a request. Calla bowed her head and quickly scurried from the room, her heart aching with a sorrow that was not entirely her own. As the heavy door closed behind her, she heard a sound from within, the sharp crack of something shattering, followed by a roar of pure, helpless rage that was instantly swallowed by the suffocating silence of the mist. Alaric's control, already tenuous, began to fray after his uncle's visit. The mist thickened around the castle, and the cold deepened, seeping into the very marrow of the stones. The servants whispered of the king's temper, of storms of ice that would spontaneously form in the corridors of the upper tower. Calla continued her duties in his chambers, the silence between them now stretched taut with unspoken tension. He was more withdrawn than ever, a formidable fortress of solitude. Yet, she persisted in her small acts of defiance. A smooth river stone left on his table, carrying the phantom scent of water and time. A raven's feather, smelling of wind and sky. She was polishing the obsidian floor near his throne one afternoon when a book, dislodged from a high shelf by a tremor of icy rage from the king, tumbled down. It landed with a heavy thud at her feet. It was a children's book, its leather cover worn smooth with age. The title was embossed in faded gold, "The Weaver of Sunlight." Instinctively, she picked it up. The pages were brittle, the illustrations simple but beautiful. depicting a mythical being who could weave sunlight into threads of warmth and hope. My mother used to read that to me. Alaric's voice was a ghost from his throne. It was the first time he had spoken to her in days. Calla looked up, surprised by the raw, unguarded pain she saw in his eyes. The scent of his grief was suddenly overwhelming. Not cold and distant, but sharp and fresh, like a newly opened wound. It smelled of lost warmth and a mother's love. She sounds like she was wonderful, Calla whispered, clutching the book to her chest. She was the sun, he said, his gaze distant. And my uncle extinguished her. The confession hung in the air, terrible and absolute. Calla's breath caught in her throat. The accident Boren had referred to, it wasn't an accident. He orchestrated my father's death and my mother's disappearance. He told everyone she ran, unable to bear her grief. He made me king, a boy he could control. He told me my grief was a weakness, that an alpha king must be made of iron and ice. He nurtured my curse. The pieces clicked into place. Boren didn't want to cure the kingdom's winter. He benefited from it. A cold, isolated king was a malleable king. He is wrong, Calla said, her voice trembling with a sudden fierce conviction. Grief is not a weakness. It is a testament to love. To have loved so deeply that the loss of it freezes the world, that is a terrible, beautiful power, my lord. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and the mask of the Frost King was gone. In its place was a man, lost and hurting, his pain so vast it had swallowed his entire world. No one has ever said that to me, he breathed, his voice hoarse. Driven by an impulse she couldn't explain, Calla took a step closer, and another. She stopped just before him, the book held between them like a shield. Read it to me, he whispered, his request so full of vulnerability it shattered her heart. She hesitated for only a second before sinking to the floor at the foot of his throne. She opened the book, her fingers tracing the faded words. Her voice was soft at first, but it grew stronger as she read the simple tale of the creature who fought darkness not with a sword, but with threads of light. As she read, she did something she hadn't dared to do before. She let her power flow, not fighting the mist, but working with it. She couldn't create the scent of sunlight, but she could weave the memory of it. She pulled the scent of his grief for his mother, that pure, aching love, and wove it into the words she spoke. She layered it with the phantom scent of the river stone, of persistence, and the raven's feather, of freedom. It was the most complex thing she had ever attempted. It was like trying to embroider a tapestry in a hurricane. But as she spoke the final words of the story, a miracle happened. A single, pure, golden beam of sunlight broke through the oppressive mist. It sliced through the frosted window and struck the center of the room, illuminating a swirl of dust motes in a brilliant, holy light. The air grew warmer. The frost on the walls receded. The scent of his grief was still there. But now it was mingled with something else. Something new and fragile. The scent of hope. Alaric slowly rose from his throne and stepped into the beam of light. He closed his eyes, tilting his face up to the impossible warmth, a solitary tear tracing a path down his stoic cheek. Calla watched, breathless, her own tears blurring her vision. She had not healed him. She had simply reminded him how to feel, and in the face of that feeling, the curse, for a single, perfect moment, had faltered. The single beam of sunlight did not last. As evening fell, the mist swirled back, and the frost reclaimed the window pane. But something had fundamentally shifted in the cold, silent tower. The oppressive emptiness had been lessened, replaced by a fragile, tentative connection. Alaric began to speak to her more, not of kingdoms or politics, but of small things. He asked her about her home, about the scents of the sunstone forest. He listened, his expression unreadable, as she described the smell of rain on hot dust, of wild honey and crushed pine needles. To him, they were exotic tales from a foreign land. In return, he told her about the books that lined his walls. He spoke of histories and myths, of worlds that existed only on paper. In his centuries of isolation, books had been his only companions. His voice, usually so flat and cold, would gain a quiet resonance when he spoke of them, a flicker of the passion that was buried so deep beneath the ice. One evening he found her tracing the intricate patterns of frost on the window. "It's beautiful," she murmured, in a sad way. "It's like a map of your pain." "I have never thought of it as beautiful," he said, his voice low beside her. "It is my failure, made visible." "It is not a failure to feel, my lord," she countered gently. "The failure is in believing you must feel it alone." He turned to face her, the space between them charged with an energy that had nothing to do with the cold. His frozen sky eyes searched her face, and for the first time, she saw not just a king, but a man. A man starved for a touch, for a kind word, for a single soul who did not fear his winter but dared to step into it. "Calla," he began, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't quite name. It smelled of longing and a deep, terrifying vulnerability. Before he could continue, the heavy doors to the chamber burst open. Ronan stood there, his face grim, his posture rigid. "My lord," he said, his voice strained. "There is an urgent situation. A delegation from the Silver Moon Pack has arrived. They have brought Lady Genevieve. Lord Boren is with them. He is announcing your betrothal." The words fell like shards of ice into the quiet warmth of the room. Betrothal. Lady Genevieve. The strong, perfect alpha female his uncle had chosen for him. Alaric went rigid. The temperature in the room dropped so fast that Calla's breath plumed in the air. The scent of his shock and fury was a physical force, a blizzard that threatened to tear the room apart. The window, which had been slowly clearing, was instantly encased in a thick, opaque sheet of ice. "He would not dare," Alaric snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl that was more wolf than man. "He has, my lord," Ronan confirmed, his own scent a tight knot of controlled anger and loyalty. "They are in the great hall. The southern lords are with them. Boren has forced your hand." This was a coup, Calla realized with a jolt of terror, a political checkmate. By announcing a betrothal publicly, Boren was boxing Alaric in. To refuse the alliance now would be a grave insult to the Silver Moon Pack, a powerful ally, and would make Alaric look weak and indecisive in front of the wavering southern lords. Boren was using the kingdom's own traditions and needs as a weapon against its king. Alaric's gaze fell on Calla. In his eyes, she saw a maelstrom of emotions, rage at his uncle's betrayal, the crushing weight of his duty, and something else. Something that looked devastatingly like despair. The fragile connection they had built, the tiny seedling of hope she had nurtured, was about to be crushed under the heel of political necessity. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice devoid of all warmth once more. The Frost King was back, his armor of ice slamming into place. "Do not leave this room." He swept past Ronan and out of the chamber, his powerful strides echoing down the corridor. The doors boomed shut behind him, leaving Calla alone in the suddenly freezing room. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering, but it wasn't from the cold. It was from the chilling certainty that Lord Boren would not stop until he had extinguished the tiny spark of warmth she had managed to ignite in his nephew's frozen heart. And if that meant extinguishing her as well, he would not hesitate. Alaric descended the tower stairs, each step a measured beat of fury. The mist in the corridors swirled violently around him, a visible manifestation of the tempest inside his soul. For centuries, He had accepted his isolation, accepted the cold. He had allowed his uncle's poisonous whispers to convince him that this was his penance, his nature. Then Calla had come, a broken, wolfless thing who had looked at his curse and called it beautiful. She had not tried to fix him. She had simply sat with him in the dark. In her presence, for the first time, the ice around his heart had begun to thaw. The silence had been filled not with words, but with a shared understanding that went deeper than any vow. And now Boren was trying to rip that away from him, to force him back into the gilded cage of a political marriage, to chain him to an alpha female who would see his vulnerability as a weakness to be exploited, or a flaw to be corrected. He entered the great hall. It was filled with wolves, more life than the castle had seen in a century. Southern lords, their sense a mix of arrogance and apprehension, stood alongside the formidable warriors of the Silvermoon Pack. At the center of them all stood his uncle, a triumphant smirk on his face. Beside Boren was a woman of striking beauty, Lady Genevieve. She was tall, with hair the color of spun silver and eyes as sharp and gray as a blade. The scent of her power was immense, a confident, dominant aura that demanded respect. She was everything a queen was supposed to be, and she was a complete stranger to him. Alaric! Boren's voice boomed with false bonhomie. Just in time. We were celebrating the wonderful news. Your betrothal to the lovely Lady Genevieve. A new era of warmth and prosperity for our kingdom is at hand. A smattering of polite, if tense, applause echoed in the cavernous hall. Alaric's gaze swept over the assembled lords, over the proud Silvermoon Alpha who was Genevieve's father, and finally settled on his uncle. His voice was quiet, yet it cut through the murmuring like a shard of glass. There is no betrothal. A collective gasp went through the hall. Boren's face darkened with rage. Lady Genevieve's perfect composure faltered for a fraction of a second, her scent flashing with the sharp sting of humiliation. "Nephew, do not be a fool," Boren hissed, his voice low and menacing. "This alliance is essential. Do not let a moment's pique destroy centuries of tradition." "It is you who is the fool, uncle," Alaric retorted, his voice rising in volume, resonating with a power that had long been dormant. "You speak of tradition, but you seek only to control. You speak of the kingdom's prosperity, but you have thrived on its cold. You mistake my grief for weakness, but you have never understood the strength it takes to endure it." He took a step forward, and the temperature in the hall dropped 20 degrees. The torches sputtered, their flames turning blue. The assembled lords shrank back, their scents turning sour with fear. "You have conspired behind my back. You have brought strangers into my home and presumed to speak for me. You have overstepped. For the last time." He looked at the Silvermoon Alpha. "Lord Callan, my uncle has misled you. I offer my deepest apologies for this insult to you and your daughter. There will be no marriage. My court is not a marketplace, and I am not for sale." Lord Callan, a proud and powerful wolf, bristled with fury, but he was also wise enough to recognize the raw, untamed power radiating from the Frost King. This was not the passive, reclusive monarch of rumor. This was an alpha of alphas, awakened and enraged. "This is an outrage!" Boren roared, his composure finally shattering. "You would doom us all for what? For some pathetic, wolfless stray you keep in your tower?" The moment the words left his mouth, he knew he had made a fatal error. Alaric moved. He was not a man anymore. He was a force of nature, a blur of shadow and ice. He crossed the hall in a heartbeat, his hand clamping around Boren's throat, lifting the older wolf clear off his feet. The air crackled with killing intent. "You," Alaric snarled, his eyes glowing with a pale, terrifying light, "will never speak of her again." He held his uncle suspended, choking, his face turning purple. The entire hall held its breath, certain they were about to witness the execution of a lord. But then, through his rage, a scent reached him. Faint, but clear. Chamomile and courage. Calla. She was in the upper gallery, drawn by the commotion. She was watching. And her scent was not just of fear for herself, but of fear for him. Fear that he would become the monster they all believed him to be. His rage faltered. He looked at the gasping, pathetic man in his grasp and felt not satisfaction, but a profound emptiness. This was Boren's way, the way of violence and dominance. It was not his. It was not hers. With a final growl of disgust, he threw his uncle to the floor. Boren landed in a heap, gasping for air. "You are stripped of your titles and your lands," Alaric declared, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "You are banished. Leave my sight. If you ever set foot in my kingdom again, I will not be so merciful." He turned his back on his sputtering uncle and faced the stunned assembly. "The Silver Moon delegation will be given guest quarters until morning. Then you too will depart. My alliance is not so easily bought." Without another word, he strode from the great hall, leaving chaos and shock in his wake. He did not go back to his tower. Instead, he went to the one place he had avoided for 200 years, the Queen's conservatory, his mother's sanctuary. It was now a ruin of frozen dead plants, a monument to his loss. But tonight, he needed to be there. He needed to remember who he was, before he decided who he was going to become. Calla had watched the entire confrontation from the shadows of the upper gallery, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had seen the raw power Alaric possessed, the killing intent in his eyes. She had also seen the moment he pulled back from the brink, the internal struggle that had saved his uncle's life, and she knew, with a certainty that resonated deep in her soul, that she had been the cause of it. Her presence, her scent, had anchored him. When he left the hall, she didn't return to the tower. She followed him. She kept to the shadows, a ghost in his wake, drawn by the scent of his turmoil. It was a chaotic blend of triumphant rage, deep-seated grief, and a new, terrifying uncertainty. He was a man who had just shattered his own cage, and now he was standing in the rubble, unsure of what to do next. He led her to a part of the castle she had never seen, a wing that was even colder and more derelict than the rest. He pushed open a set of crystalline doors, the sound of their cracking like breaking hearts. She peered in after him. It had once been a greenhouse, a conservatory filled with plants. Now it was a graveyard of ice. The glass ceiling was thick with frost, and the skeletal remains of exotic flowers and trees were perfectly preserved in crystal-clear ice, their frozen leaves and petals like delicate glass sculptures. In the center of the room was a stone bench, and Alaric sank onto it, burying his head in his hands. The scent in this room was different. Underneath the fresh agony of the king, there was an older, deeper layer of sorrow. It was the scent of his mother, faint, like a pressed flower in a forgotten book. But it was there, lavender and sunshine, love and life. This had been her place. Calla stepped out of the shadows and into the frozen conservatory. The crunch of her boots on the icy floor made Alaric look up, his eyes wild and haunted. "You followed me," he stated. It was not an accusation. "You smelled lost," she said simply, moving closer. She sat on the bench beside him, though she kept a respectful distance. The cold radiating from him was intense, but she didn't flinch. "This was my mother's," he said, his voice thick. "She could make anything grow. Even here, in the heart of the north. She said love was its own kind of sunlight." He gave a bitter laugh. "When she was gone, it all froze. Just like me." He looked at the frozen plants, at the beautiful, dead things that surrounded them. "My uncle was right about one thing. I am my father's son. His grief killed him. Mine is killing a kingdom. No, Calla said, her voice soft but firm. Your grief isn't killing the kingdom. Your belief that you have to carry it alone is. You've built walls of ice around your heart, my lord. But walls don't just keep others out. They imprison you. He turned to look at her, his expression raw. How? How do I tear them down? I have been this way for so long I don't remember how to be anything else. This cold. It is me. No, it's not, she insisted. I have smelled your loneliness. I have smelled your grief. And today, in the great hall, I smelled your rage. But I have also smelled your curiosity, your love for stories, your ache for a memory of the sun. The ice is not you. It is the storm that hides you. She reached out, her movements slow and deliberate, and placed her small, warm hand over his much larger one, where it rested on the icy bench. His hand was as cold as marble. He flinched at the contact, a tremor running through his powerful frame. It was likely the first gentle human touch he had felt in centuries. You don't have to be the Frost King, she whispered, her gaze locked with his. You can just be Alaric. At her touch, at her words, something deep inside him broke. A single hot tear fell from his eye and landed on their joined hands. Where it touched, the ice on the bench hissed and melted. A shuddering breath escaped him. The scent of his loneliness began to recede, replaced by a fragile, terrifyingly new scent. Trust. He didn't pull his hand away. Instead, his fingers, cold and stiff, slowly curled around hers, engulfing her hand in his. The contact was electric, a spark of warmth in the heart of winter. Calla, he breathed, her name a prayer. In that moment, the power dynamic between them ceased to exist. They were not a king and a tribute. They were two broken souls, finding solace in a frozen garden, their shared touch a promise that even the longest winter must eventually end. A new feeling began to bloom between them, more powerful than any curse, more enduring than any frost. It was the scent of a beginning. News of Lord Boren's banishment and the dismissal of the Silver Moon delegation spread through the castle like wildfire. The silent gray servants began to move with a new energy, their muted scents flickering with curiosity and a hesitant hope. The atmosphere in the castle, while still cold, had lost some of its oppressive, tomb-like quality. Alaric was a changed man. The act of defying his uncle had broken a dam within him. He was still quiet, still reserved, but the suffocating aura of desolation that had clung to him was lifting, like a morning fog burning away. He began to emerge from his tower, walking the halls of his own castle for the first time in years. He spoke with the guards, questioned the cooks, and listened to the reports from his beta, Ronan, with a new, sharp attention. Ronan watched this transformation with a mixture of relief and apprehension. He was fiercely loyal to his king, and he hated Boren's influence, but Calla was an unknown variable, an omega, wolfless and from a disgraced line, holding such sway over the most powerful alpha in the world. It was unprecedented. It defied all logic, all tradition. Yet, he could not deny the evidence before him. The king was healing. Calla's role shifted as well. She was no longer a servant, confined to his chambers. She became his shadow, his constant companion. They spent their days in the royal library, a place Alaric had always loved but had used as another form of isolation. Now it became their sanctuary. He would read to her from ancient texts, his deep voice bringing forgotten histories to life. She, in turn, would tell him stories of her own, not grand tales of heroes, but small, intimate stories of the people in her pack, of their hopes and fears, all translated through the language of scent she knew so well. Through her, he began to understand his people not as subjects to be ruled, but as individuals with rich emotional lives. He had been blind to it, deafened by the silence of his mist. She was teaching him a new language. One afternoon, as they sat by the fire in the library, a rare moment of warmth, Alaric looked at her, his expression serious. "My uncle was right about one thing," he said, causing Calla to tense. "The southern lords are restless. My actions in the Great Hall were necessary, but they have created instability. They saw my power, but they also saw me reject a powerful alliance. They will see it as a weakness, an emotional decision." "What will you do?" she asked, her heart sinking. She feared he would say he had to reconsider the marriage to Lady Genevieve. "I am going to hold a royal council," he announced, his gaze steady. "I am summoning all the vassal lords from every corner of the kingdom. They will come to the fortress, and they will meet their king. Not the phantom from the stories, but the man. And—" He paused, reaching out to take her hand, his touch now familiar and warm. "They will meet you." Calla's eyes widened in panic. "Me? But I am nobody. A wolfless omega. They will laugh at you. It will only make things worse." "No," he said, his grip tightening gently. "They will see what I see." That strength is not just measured in the sharpness of claws. They have lived in a world without scent for 200 years. Their senses are dull. Their connections to each other, to their people, are frayed. You, Calla, are the cure. You can teach them to feel again, just as you are teaching me. It was a terrifying, audacious plan to present her, the lowest of the low, as the key to the kingdom's future. It was a direct challenge to the foundations of their society, to the ideals of alpha dominance and physical power. It was a gamble that could unite the kingdom behind him or shatter it into open rebellion. "I can't," she whispered, the old insecurities, the scent of her own shame rising up to choke her. "I'm not strong enough." Alaric brought her hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. The gesture was so tender, so full of reverence, it stole her breath. "You are the strongest person I have ever known," he said, his frozen sky eyes blazing with a conviction that left no room for doubt. "You walked into the heart of winter and did not fear the cold. You faced a monster and saw only a man. They will see it too. I will make them see it." She looked into his eyes, and she saw his faith in her. It was a gift more precious than any crown. For her entire life, she had been told she was worthless. Now, a king was telling her she was the hope of a kingdom. And as she smelled the unwavering loyalty and the burgeoning love radiating from him, she found a flicker of that same faith in herself. "All right," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. "I will try." The summons went out, carried by ravens to the far corners of the kingdom. The lords of the realm were called to the frosty heart of their nation for a royal council, the first in living memory. The news was met with a mixture of shock, suspicion, and intrigue. For 2 centuries, the king had been a recluse. Now he was demanding their presence. Something was changing in the north. As the lords and their retinues began to arrive, the castle, once a silent tomb, was filled with a cacophony of new sounds and, for Calla, a bewildering flood of new scents. The mist still suppressed the aromas, but it could not completely smother the sheer volume of life now packed within the walls. She smelled the earthy grit of the mountain clans, the briny tang of the coastal lords, and the dusty arrogance of the ancient houses from the south. It was overwhelming, a tidal wave of emotion and personality that left her head spinning. The lords were a formidable group, hulking alphas with scars on their faces and power radiating from them like heat. They looked at the perpetually winter-bound castle with disdain and eyed the king's beta, Ronan, with suspicion. They murmured in corners, their conversations full of doubt. He rejected the Silver Moon Alliance. she overheard one lord grumble to another. An act of madness. Boren may have been ambitious, but he understood politics. They say he is still lost in his grief, another added. That the curse has finally claimed his mind. Calla felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. Alaric's gamble felt more and more like a fool's hope. These were hard, practical men. They would not be swayed by talk of emotion and connection. Alaric kept her close, a silent statement to all who saw them. She stood by his side as he greeted each delegation, her simple wool dress a stark contrast to the silks and furs of the noble ladies who eyed her with a mixture of pity and contempt. She was an anomaly, a question mark at the center of the court. "Who is she?" a lady whispered behind her fan, her scent a cloying mix of rosewater and spite. "Some kind of pet?" Calla flinched, but Alaric's hand found hers, his grip firm and reassuring under the cover of his cloak. He leaned down, his voice a low murmur for her ears only. "Let them whisper. Their words are wind. What we do will be the storm." The night before the council, the tension in the castle was palpable. Alaric took Calla to the Queen's conservatory. It was still frozen, but the air within felt less desolate, charged with a new potential. "Are you afraid?" he asked, his gaze searching hers in the ghostly light. "Yes," she admitted. "They see me as you once did. As refuse. A joke." "I was a fool," he said, his voice laced with self-recrimination. "I was blind and deaf and frozen. You taught me how to see. Tomorrow you will not be on trial. They will be. I will ask them to look beyond what they know, to value what they have forgotten. It is they who must prove they are worthy of the future, not you." He stepped closer, framing her face with his hands. His touch was warm now, the chill of his skin a memory. "Whatever happens tomorrow, Calla, know this. You have already saved one life in this kingdom. You saved mine." He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound, aching tenderness. It was a kiss of gratitude, of reverence, of a hope so fierce it felt like a physical force. His lips were soft, and they tasted of the cold, clean air and the faintest hint of the man he was becoming. In that moment, all her fear dissolved, replaced by a love so powerful it felt like it could melt every glacier in the kingdom. The scent of it filled the frozen conservatory, not chamomile and courage, but sunlight and lavender, earth and sky. It was the scent of two souls finally, irrevocably, finding their home in one another. When he pulled away, his eyes were shining with an emotion that mirrored her own. "The mate bond," he whispered, his voice full of awe. "It's faint, dulled by the mist, but it's there. I can feel you." Calla's heart soared, the fated connection between shifters, the one thing her wolfless state had supposedly denied her. It was real. With him. "I have always felt you," she answered, her own tears beginning to fall. They stood together in the frozen garden, two outcasts bound by a fate that was about to be tested in a hall full of powerful, skeptical wolves. But now, they would not face it as a king and his tribute. They would face it as mates. The great hall was arranged for the council. The long tables had been removed, replaced by chairs set in a semicircle facing the twin thrones on the dais. It was a stark, intimidating setup. The assembled lords took their seats, their faces grim, their armor gleaming in the cold torchlight. The air was thick with the scent of skepticism and challenge. Alaric entered the hall with Calla at his side. He was not wearing a crown or the heavy furs of the Frost King. He was dressed in simple black leather, the attire of a warrior, not a monarch. Calla wore a plain gray dress, her only adornment a single raven's feather Alaric had given her, tucked into her braided hair. Their simple appearance was a deliberate statement, a rejection of the pomp and ceremony the lords had expected. A hostile murmur rippled through the crowd as they saw Calla walk with him, not behind him. He led her not to a seat at the foot of the dais, but to the second throne, the one that had sat empty for 200 years, the queen's throne. The murmuring exploded into outraged shouts. "This is an insult!" bellowed Lord Valerius, a barrel-chested lord from the south, his scent a mix of sour wine and fury. "You would place a wolfless Omega on the throne of the queen? She has no station. No bloodline," another cried. Alaric stood before them, letting their anger wash over him. He remained silent until the shouts died down to a resentful grumbling. Then he spoke, his voice calm but carrying to every corner of the hall. "You are right," he began, the admission stunning them into silence. "She has no great title. Her bloodline is considered disgraced. She possesses no wolf. By every law and tradition we hold dear, she is the weakest among us." He paused, his gaze sweeping over their faces. "And yet, this weak Omega has done what none of you, with all your strength and power, could do. She has brought the sun back to my tower." A few of the lords scoffed, but others shifted uncomfortably, remembering the rumors of a light seen in the king's window. "For 2 centuries," Alaric continued, his voice resonating with a deep, personal pain, "we have lived in this frost. We have accepted it as a curse, a penance. We have grown used to the silence, to the numbness. Our senses have dulled. We cannot smell the fear of our people, the loyalty of our soldiers, the sickness in our lands. We lead by sight and by sound, but we are blind to the heart of our kingdom." He turned and looked at Calla, his expression softening. "This woman, Calla, speaks a language we have forgotten. The language of scent, the language of the soul. She can smell a lie before it is spoken. She can feel a coming rebellion in the air like a change in the weather. Her gift is not one of claws and teeth. It is a gift of perception, of empathy. A gift this kingdom desperately needs." "Empathy is not a weapon," Lord Valerius shouted, getting to his feet. "How will her perception stop an invasion from the wild clans of the borderlands? How will her empathy fill our granaries for the winter?" "Because our greatest enemy is not the wild clans," Alaric countered, his voice like steel. "It is the cold in our own hearts. It is the division between us. It is the ambition that leads a wolf to betray his own blood." His eyes flickered with a dangerous light, a clear reference to Borin. "We have valued one kind of strength for too long, and it has led us to this frozen ruin. I offer you a new way, a kingdom that is strong not only in its arms but in its heart. A kingdom that is united not just by fear of its king, but by a genuine connection to one another." He took Calla's hand, holding it up for all to see. "This is my choice. Not as a bride for a political alliance, but as my mate, my queen. She is the future of this kingdom. Her sight will be my guide, and her heart will be its warmth. I ask you to trust me, to trust her, to help us lead you out of this winter." Silence. A deep, profound silence filled the hall. The lords looked from their king, who spoke with a passion they had never seen, to the small, terrified girl on the queen's throne. They were being asked to abandon everything they had ever known, to place their faith in a concept, empathy, that seemed alien and weak. Calla's heart was hammering. She could smell their conflict, their deep-seated prejudice warring with the undeniable power in Alaric's words. The fate of the kingdom hung in this moment, balanced on the edge of a knife. Then, one figure moved. Ronan, the stoic, ever-loyal Beta, who had been standing guard by the dais. He stepped forward, turned to face the assembly, and drew his sword, plunging it tip-first into the stone floor before the thrones. It was the ancient gesture of a Beta renewing his fealty. "I stand with my king." Ronan's voice was rough with emotion. "And my queen." His act broke the spell. One by one, then in twos and threes, other lords rose, the younger ones first, those who had grown up knowing nothing but the cold and yearned for a change. Then, hesitantly, some of the older, wiser lords, who recognized the truth in Alaric's words. They drew their own weapons and pledged their loyalty. Not all of them did. Lord Valerius and a handful of his southern allies remained seated, their faces thunderous, their scents thick with rebellion. But it was a minority. The tide had turned. Alaric had not won a battle with swords, but with words. He had offered them not a command, but a choice, and most of them had chosen hope. Calla looked at the sea of faces, at the swords planted in the stone, and for the first time in her life, the scent of shame was gone. In its place was the smell of loyalty, of hope, and of a new, fragile respect. She was not just Calla, the wolfless Omega. She was their queen. The aftermath of the council was a flurry of activity. Alaric, invigorated and decisive, worked tirelessly. He met with the loyal lords, forging new strategies, listening to their concerns, and, with Calla's quiet guidance, learning to read the subtle emotional currents beneath their political posturing. Calla, in turn, found herself in a role she could never have imagined. The ladies of the court who had once scorned her now sought her out, their initial contempt replaced by a wary curiosity. She started small. She taught them to identify the herbs that could be used to create calming scents, to be placed in sick rooms or nurseries. She showed them how scent could be used in diplomacy, how a room scented with honest, earthy aromas could encourage truthfulness, while one filled with cloying, artificial perfumes put everyone on edge. They began to see her peculiar talent, not as a strange magic, but as a practical, valuable skill. But Lord Valerius and his dissenting faction were not idle. They had retreated to their southern holdings, and whispers of their discontent grew louder. They sent messengers to the Silver Moon Pack, attempting to stoke the fires of their wounded pride. They spread rumors that the king was bewitched by a powerless Omega, that his mind was broken, and that the kingdom was vulnerable. Alaric knew a confrontation was inevitable. Valerius believes in the old ways, he told Calla one evening as they stood on a balcony, watching the weak, silvery light of the northern moon. He sees my choice of you as the ultimate proof of my weakness. He will not rest until he has broken us. He cannot break us, Calla said, leaning against him. The cold mist still swirled around the castle, but it was thinner now, less oppressive. The king's growing emotional stability was slowly starving his own curse. What we have is stronger than his hate. I know, Alaric murmured, wrapping his arm around her, but he can still hurt our people. He is trying to rally the southern armies. He intends to march on the fortress. The scent of Alaric's worry was a sharp metallic tang under his usual calm. He was not afraid for himself, but for his kingdom, for the fragile peace he was trying to build, and for her. Their fragile progress was put to a terrible test a week later. A sickness broke out in the lower levels of the castle, where the servants and their families lived. It was a strange, wasting illness that seemed to attack the spirit as much as the body. The afflicted grew listless, their senses dulled, their will to live fading away. The castle healers were baffled. Calla went to the infirmary against the advice of Ronan and the protestations of Alaric, who feared for her safety. The moment she entered, she knew this was no natural illness. The air was thick with a scent she had never encountered before. It was a smell of absolute despair, but it was artificial, manufactured. It was cloying and wrong, a scent designed to smother hope. It was a weapon. Poison, she breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. Not for the body, but for the soul. A scent poison. It was a dark and twisted perversion of her own gift. Someone had weaponized despair. She worked tirelessly, moving from bed to bed. The victims were barely responsive, lost in a fog of apathy. She couldn't simply weave a counterscent. The poison was too strong, actively attacking any positive emotion. She realized she couldn't fight it directly. She had to go around it. She sat with a small child, a little boy whose breathing was shallow. She didn't try to weave a scent of happiness or health. Instead, she focused on one simple, powerful memory from her own life. The scent of her sister, Sarah, braiding her hair. The smell of clean hair, of Sarah's fierce, protective love, of the sun on the stones outside their home. She didn't project the scent into the room. She wove it directly into the boy's own muted scent, a tiny personal thread of connection. It was incredibly draining, requiring immense concentration. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the boy's eyelids fluttered. He turned his head toward her, a flicker of recognition in his dull eyes. A single tear rolled down his cheek. He was fighting. It was a start. A tiny victory, but a victory nonetheless. Alaric found her there hours later, pale and exhausted but resolute, still sitting by the child's bed. He saw the flicker of life in the boy's eyes and understood. "Valerius," he said, his voice a low, deadly growl. "This has his mark. Cruelty disguised as strength." "He didn't just want to undermine your rule," Calla said, her voice weary. "He wanted to prove that my gift, that empathy itself, is a vulnerability that can be attacked and destroyed. He's trying to poison the very idea you are fighting for." Alaric's hands clenched into fists. The rage that emanated from him was a palpable thing, a wave of Arctic cold. But when he looked at Calla, at her exhausted but determined face, the rage was tempered by a fierce, protective love. "He will fail," Alaric vowed. "You have shown us the way. Now I will show him the strength of a king who fights for the heart of his people, not just for their obedience." The battle lines had been drawn. It was no longer just a political struggle. It was a war for the soul of the kingdom. The scent poison was a declaration of war. Alaric sent his swiftest riders to the loyal lords, calling his banners. The fortress, once a place of silence, now echoed with the clang of steel being sharpened and the low murmur of soldiers preparing for a fight. The coming conflict was not just about fealty. It was a referendum on the future Alaric and Calla had proposed. Calla, meanwhile, led the effort against the poison. She organized the castle women, teaching them her methods. They became her scent weavers, a small army fighting not with swords, but with memory and hope. They gathered personal mementos from the families of the sick, a worn blanket, a child's toy, a lock of hair, and Calla taught them how to draw out the residual emotional scents and weave them into the aura of the afflicted. It was slow, painstaking work, but it was working. One by one, the victims of the poison began to stir from their stupor, anchored to the world by these threads of love. Alaric watched her, his heart filled with a mixture of pride and fear. She was his queen in every sense of the word, leading her people with a quiet strength that shamed the brutish posturing of his enemies. But she was also his mate, and the thought of her being in danger was a constant gnawing ache in his chest. The day the scouts returned with news of Lord Valerius's army marching north, a heavy gloom settled over the castle. They were outnumbered. Valerius had successfully allied with the spurned Silver Moon Pack and several other southern houses who clung to the old ways. That night, Alaric found Calla in the library, poring over ancient maps. Her face was pale with exhaustion, but her eyes were bright with a fierce intelligence. "You should be resting," he said gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I can't," she said, her finger tracing a line on the map. "Valerius thinks you will wait for him here, behind these walls. He thinks he can lay siege and let the cold and his poison do the work for him. He expects a defensive war." "It is our best option," Alaric admitted. "The fortress is nearly impregnable." "But it concedes the kingdom to him while we hide," she countered, looking up at him. "And it means a long, drawn-out fight, where more people will suffer." "There is another way." She pointed to a narrow, treacherous path on the map, a pass through the Frostfang Mountains known as the Widow's Needle. "The old tales say this pass is haunted, that the winds that howl through it carry the voices of the dead. No army has ever attempted to cross it." "For good reason," Alaric said grimly. "It is a death trap. One blizzard and an entire army would be lost." "But the mist is yours, Alaric," she said, her eyes intense. "You control the cold. You have been fighting it, suppressing it. What if you used it? What if you embraced the part of you that is the Frost King? You could guide an army through that pass, shield them from the worst of the storm, and fall on Valerius's flank when he least expects it. You could end this war in a single, decisive blow." He stared at her, stunned. She was asking him to wield the very curse he had spent centuries fighting, to turn his greatest shame into his greatest weapon. It was a terrifying, brilliant strategy. It was the thinking of a queen. "It would be a great risk," he said, his mind racing. "If I lose control, even for a moment." "You won't," she said, her faith in him absolute. "Because you won't be alone. I will be with you." "No," he said immediately, his voice harsh. "It is too dangerous. I will not risk you on a battlefield." "I am not asking for your permission, my lord," she replied, her tone firm but gentle. She stood and placed her hands on his chest, right over his heart. "Your control over the mist is tied to your emotions. When you are calm, it recedes. When you are in turmoil, it rages. In the heart of a battle, with the lives of your men on the line, you will be in turmoil. You need an anchor. Let me be that anchor." He looked down at her, at this small, wolfless woman who possessed more courage than any alpha warrior he had ever known. She was right. Her presence, her scent, her very soul had become the calm at the center of his internal storm. Without her, the plan was reckless. With her, it just might work. The mate bond pulsed between them, a silent affirmation. This was their path. Together. "So be it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "We will show them the true power of the North. Not just the cold of its winter, but the fire of its heart." The plan was set in motion. Alaric gathered his most trusted warriors, a smaller, faster force capable of navigating the treacherous mountain pass. The larger part of his army remained at the fortress under Ronan's command, tasked with making a show of preparing for a long siege to deceive Valerius's scouts. Calla rode with Alaric's vanguard. Dressed in warm leathers and furs, she was a small, determined figure amidst the towering, battle-hardened wolves. Some of the soldiers looked at her with doubt, but none dared to question the king's command. Alaric himself rode beside her, a protective, formidable presence. As they entered the Frostfang Mountains, the natural cold of the peaks combined with the king's mist to create a brutal, unforgiving environment. The wind howled through the rocks, a physical assault that carried razor-sharp shards of ice. This was the first true test. Alaric closed his eyes, his face a mask of concentration. He was not fighting the cold anymore. He was reaching into it, commanding it. Calla could smell the immense effort it took, the scent of ozone and sheer willpower radiating from him. Slowly, miraculously, the wind lashing at their column began to lessen. A pocket of relative calm formed around them, a moving bubble of sanctuary in the heart of the blizzard. The snow still fell, but the deadly, biting wind was held at bay. The soldiers stared in awe, their doubt turning to a fierce, unwavering belief in their king. Calla's role was just as crucial. She rode beside Alaric, her senses stretched to their limit. She monitored his emotional state as closely as a navigator watches a compass. When she smelled the sharp tang of his frustration or the cold spike of his fear for his men, she would reach out and touch his arm, a simple physical contact. Or she would murmur a quiet word, reminding him of a story from the library, of their plans for the spring. And she wove her scents, not for the whole army, but for him alone. She created a constant, subtle aura around him, the phantom scent of the warm library fire, of old paper and ink, of the lavender from his mother's ruined garden. These were the scents of his peace, of his humanity. They were the anchor that kept the Frost King from being consumed by his own power. They traveled for 2 days through the hellish landscape, a ghost army moving through a place no living thing was meant to be. The soldiers, inspired by their king's power and their queen's quiet fortitude, pushed on without complaint. On the 3rd morning they emerged from the pass. Below them, spread out in the valley, was the camp of Lord Valerius's army. It was a massive, sprawling encampment, confident and unprepared, their backs to the mountains they believed to be impassable. The trap was set. Alaric looked down at the enemy army. Then he looked at Calla. Her face was chapped by the wind, her body weary, but her eyes shone with love and an unshakable belief in him. He had faced battles before, fought with the strength of a king and the fury of an alpha. But today, he would fight with the heart of a man who had something precious to protect. He drew his sword, the ancient steel ringing in the cold, clear air. "For the north!" he roared, his voice echoing down the mountainside. "For our queen!" And with a sound like an avalanche, his army charged down the slope, a wave of vengeance and new hope, with the fury of a controlled blizzard at their backs. The battle for the kingdom's soul had begun. The attack was a devastating success. Valerius's army, caught completely by surprise, was thrown into chaos. Alaric and his warriors crashed into their flank like a tidal wave of ice and steel, scattering their formations and shattering their morale. The controlled blizzard Alaric had maintained in the pass was now unleashed upon the valley, a swirling vortex of snow and wind that blinded and disoriented his enemies. Calla remained at the top of the ridge with a small contingent of guards, her vantage point giving her a clear view of the battle. It was a terrifying, brutal ballet of violence, but her focus was not on the chaos. It was on Alaric. She could see him, a dark figure on a massive black warhorse cutting a swath through the enemy ranks. He was a terrifying, beautiful sight, the full power of the Frost King on display. Her task was to maintain his anchor. She closed her eyes, shutting out the sights and sounds of the battle, and focused solely on his scent. It was a maelstrom of battle rage, cold fury, and fierce, protective love. It was a precarious balance. She poured all of her energy into reinforcing the sense of calm, of home, of her, a lifeline of warmth in his storm of violence. The battle raged for over an hour. Alaric's smaller force fought with the ferocity of wolves defending their territory, their morale soaring. They were not just fighting for a king, they were fighting for a future they had just begun to believe in. Finally, the enemy lines broke completely. Soldiers began throwing down their weapons and surrendering, while others fled into the disorienting blizzard. Victory was at hand. But Lord Valerius was not yet defeated. Calla saw him, rallying a small group of his most loyal houseguard, not to flee, but to charge directly toward Alaric. It was a desperate, suicidal move, but Valerius's scent was a toxic brew of pure, nihilistic hatred. If he was going to die, he would take the king with him. "He's going for Alaric!" Calla cried to her guards. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced her concentration. For a moment, her focus on Alaric wavered, her own terror overwhelming her. Down in the valley, Alaric felt the shift instantly. The warm, steadying anchor in his mind flickered. The blizzard, which he had been keeping focused on the enemy flanks, suddenly raged out of control, the temperature dropping to deadly levels, affecting his own men as well as the enemy. He faltered, a wave of icy cold washing through his own veins, a backlash from his overextended power. It was the opening Valerius needed. He crashed into Alaric, his sword a blur of silver. Alaric, caught off balance, managed to parry the blow, but the force of it knocked him from his horse. He landed hard on the frozen ground, the breath driven from his lungs. Before he could recover, Valerius was upon him, his face a mask of triumphant fury. "The kingdom needs a true alpha!" Valerius roared, raising his sword for a final killing blow. "Not a lovesick fool!" From her position on the ridge, Calla watched in horror. The guards were moving to protect her, to pull her back. But she shook them off. She couldn't fight. She couldn't physically intervene, but she was not helpless. She screamed his name. "Alaric!" Then she did the most dangerous thing she had ever attempted. She didn't just project a scent. She gathered every ounce of her love for him, every memory of their time together, every hope for their future, and she flung it at him, a raw, concentrated bolt of pure emotion. It was not a weave. It was a physical force, a soul-deep cry. She poured all of herself into that single desperate act. The effort tore through her, and she collapsed to her knees, the world going gray at the edges of her vision. Down below, the bolt of emotion struck Alaric like lightning. It cut through the cold, the pain, the chaos of the battle. It was Calla. Her love, her life, her very essence flooding his senses. It was a fire in his frozen veins, a supernova in his soul. The mist around him didn't just rage, it solidified. Shards of black ice, sharp as obsidian, erupted from the ground around him, forming a protective cage. Valerius's sword, descending for the kill, shattered against the impossible barrier. Valerius stared in shock, his attack thwarted. Alaric rose to his feet, his eyes glowing with a terrifying, otherworldly light. He was no longer just channeling the mist. He was the mist. He was the winter. "You are right, Valerius." Alaric's voice was the sound of a glacier cracking, of an avalanche falling. "The kingdom does need a true alpha." He raised a hand, and the black ice lanced out, piercing Valerius's heart. The Southern Lord froze, his expression of triumph turning to one of shocked disbelief, before he crumbled into a shower of ice and dust. The battle was over. Silence fell over the valley, broken only by the whistling of the wind. Alaric stood, breathing heavily, the black ice receding back into the ground. The overwhelming power began to fade, leaving him swaying with exhaustion. His first thought was of Calla. He looked up at the ridge and saw her collapsed form. A terror colder than any winter seized him. Forgetting the surrendering soldiers, forgetting his victory, he ran, his heart pounding with a single desperate prayer. Alaric reached the ridge, his heart a block of ice in his chest. He fell to his knees beside Calla's still form, his guards parting before him like the sea. Her skin was ashen, her breathing shallow, the vibrant scent of her, that constant whisper of chamomile and courage, was terrifyingly faint. "Calla," he breathed, his voice breaking. He gathered her into his arms. She was limp, her head lolling against his shoulder. He had felt her desperate final push, the raw power of her soul crying out to his. He knew, with dreadful certainty, that she had sacrificed a part of herself to save him. "She exhausted herself, my lord," one of the guards said, his voice full of awe. "We've never seen anything like it." Alaric barely heard him. He pressed his forehead to hers, pouring his own energy, his own life force, into her through the mate bond. It was a frantic, desperate act. He had just won a kingdom, but the victory was ash in his mouth if he lost her. "Don't leave me," he whispered against her skin. "Please, Calla." Stay with me. We were supposed to see the spring. Slowly, agonizingly, a flicker of warmth returned to her skin. Her eyelids fluttered. She let out a soft moan, her brow furrowing in pain. Alaric? Her voice was a thread of sound. Relief, so potent it was dizzying, washed over him. I'm here. I'm here. He held her, rocking her gently, heedless of the soldiers and the prisoners watching from the valley below. He was no king in that moment, just a male terrified of losing his mate. The journey back to the fortress was a somber affair. The victory was absolute, but the queen was wounded. Alaric never left her side, carrying her himself. He brought her not to the healers, but to the queen's conservatory. He laid her down on the cold stone bench where they had first touched, bundling her in the warmest furs. He did not know how to heal her body, but he knew he had to heal the part of her she had expended, her spirit. He sat beside her for hours, for days. He held her hand and he talked to her. He didn't read from books of heroes or kings. He told her stories of his own. He told her about his mother, about the silly songs she used to sing while she gardened. He told her about his father, a good man broken by grief. He confessed his deepest fears, his centuries of loneliness, his terror that he would never be worthy of the love she had so freely given him. He poured his soul out to her, every memory, every pain, every fragile hope. And as he spoke, he focused on the sense of his stories, weaving them for her just as she had always done for him. He offered her the scent of his mother's lavender, of his father's leathery workshop, of his own unwavering, absolute love. He did not know if it was working. She remained pale and weak, drifting in and out of consciousness. The mist around the castle, no longer under his conscious control, swirled thick and heavy again, mirroring his fear and despair. The brief hope that had bloomed in the kingdom began to wither. The king had won the battle, the whispers said, but he was losing his queen, and with her, he was losing himself all over again. On the third day, Ronan entered the conservatory, his face etched with worry. My lord, the men are growing restless. The prisoners need to be dealt with. The kingdom needs its king. The kingdom has a king, Alaric said, not taking his eyes off Cala's face. He is sitting right here, and he will not leave his queen. Just then, Cala's fingers twitched in his. Her eyes opened, no longer clouded with pain, but clear and lucid. She looked at him, a faint smile touching her lips. A king also needs to eat. Tears streamed down Alaric's face, hot and cleansing. He lowered his head, pressing his lips to her hand, his shoulders shaking with relief. She was weak, but she was back. Her inner light, though dimmed, had not been extinguished. As he held her hand, a strange warmth spread from their joined fingers. He looked down. On the frozen stalk of a long-dead rosebush beside the bench, a single, impossible bud was beginning to form. The ice around its stem was melting. Cala had not just saved him on the battlefield. Her sacrifice, and his subsequent outpouring of love and memory, had done something more. It had planted a seed in the heart of the unending winter. The true healing of the land was finally beginning. Cala's recovery was slow, but steady. The single rose in the conservatory bloomed, a defiant splash of crimson in the frozen world, and it became a symbol of the kingdom's own fragile recovery. As Cala regained her strength, the mist around the castle began to recede in earnest. For the first time in 2 centuries, the people in the capital saw glimpses of a pale, watery sun. With Cala once again at his side, a true partner in rule, Alaric governed with a newfound wisdom and confidence. The captured soldiers from Valerius's army were not executed, but given a choice: swear a new oath and be integrated into the king's army, or be exiled to the south. Most, having witnessed the power and surprising mercy of the Frost King, chose to swear fealty. The kingdom was changing. The story of the Battle of the Widow's Needle became a legend, whispered in taverns and sung by bards. It wasn't just a tale of military genius. It was the story of their wolfless queen, whose love was a weapon more powerful than any sword, and their king, who drew his strength not from his isolation, but from his connection to his mate. The old hierarchies began to crumble. Strength was no longer seen as purely physical. The perception and empathy that Kala embodied were now valued. She established a small school within the castle, teaching young shifters, and even some humans, the basics of scent weaving, not as a magic, but as a tool for understanding, healing, and diplomacy. Several months after the battle, on a day when the sun was shining with a surprising warmth, Alaric led Kala back to the great hall. It was not filled with grim-faced lords, but with the people of the castle, the guards, the servants, the cooks, the healers. He led her to the dais, before the twin thrones. Ronan stood waiting, holding a simple circlet woven from the branches of the first new sapling to sprout in the conservatory. "We were bonded by fate in a frozen garden," Alaric said, his voice ringing with an emotion that everyone in the hall could feel. "We were forged in the crucible of battle. But a union must be witnessed by the pack." He turned to her, his frozen sky eyes blazing with a love so bright it could have melted a glacier. "Kala of no house, weaver of sense, heart of my heart, and queen of my soul, will you formally accept my mark? Will you be my mate, before the eyes of our people?" Tears of joy streamed down Kala's face. "There has never been a moment I was not yours," she whispered. With a smile that transformed his harsh, beautiful face, Alaric leaned in. He gently brushed the hair from her neck, and with a tenderness that belied the sharpness of his teeth, he bit down, sealing their bond. A jolt of pure energy, warm and golden, shot through Kala. It was the final, formal click of a lock falling into place. The mate bond, once a faint whisper, now roared to life, a symphony of love and connection that resonated in every fiber of her being. She felt his strength, his joy, his unwavering devotion pour into her, and she sent her own love flooding back into him. Through the bond, she felt the last vestiges of his curse, the deep, ancient ice of his grief, finally shatter and melt away under the warmth of their completed union. The people in the hall erupted in a cheer, a genuine, heartfelt roar of approval and celebration. The king and his Omega Queen, the outcasts who had saved them all, were finally, formally, one. As Alaric pulled back, he lowered his head and nuzzled the mark on her neck. Kala's scent, once the faint aroma of wilting herbs, was now a rich, complex perfume of chamomile, courage, sunlight, and love, the scent of a queen. And for the first time, from the man beside her, she could smell a new, dominant note in his scent. Not loneliness, not grief, not even power. It was the simple, profound, and earthy scent of peace. The winter was truly over. 1 year later, the Queen's conservatory was no longer a frozen graveyard. It was a riot of life and color, a lush, verdant paradise teeming with flowers and plants from every corner of the kingdom. The glass roof, once thick with frost, was now clear, and brilliant sunlight streamed in, warming the air. The king's mist was a memory, a story told to wide-eyed children. Kala sat on the stone bench, which was now covered in soft moss. In her arms she held a small sleeping bundle wrapped in soft linen, her son, Cygnus. He had his father's dark hair and, when he was awake, his mother's perceptive, intelligent eyes. He smelled of milk and new beginnings. Alaric sat beside her, his arm wrapped securely around her shoulders. He was watching his son with an expression of quiet, profound awe. The harsh lines of his face had been softened by happiness, the haunted look in his eyes replaced by a steady, gentle warmth. He was no longer the Frost King. He was simply Alaric, a husband and a father. The kingdom was thriving. The alliance with the Silver Moon Pack had been reforged, this time built on mutual respect rather than political maneuvering. Lady Genevieve, it turned out, was relieved not to be married to a man she didn't know, and had become a surprisingly staunch ally. The Southern lords, seeing the prosperity and stability of Alaric's rule, had long since bent the knee in genuine loyalty. Calla's school had flourished. Scent weavers, now called empaths, served in courts and infirmaries across the land. The ability to understand and heal the heart was now considered a strength as vital as the ability to wield a sword. "He has your determination," Alaric murmured, his finger gently tracing the baby's cheek. "I saw him trying to shift his blanket for a full 10 minutes this morning. He refused to give up." Calla laughed, a light, happy sound. "He has your scent, though. That hint of winter air and ancient stone, but with a bit of sunshine mixed in." He leaned over and kissed her, a slow, deep kiss full of the comfortable intimacy of a love that was both a grand legend and a simple, everyday truth. "None of this would be possible without you," he said against her lips. "You walked into my winter and taught my heart how to beat again." "You taught me that being different wasn't a curse," she replied, her hand resting over his on her shoulder. "You saw a queen when everyone else, including me, saw an outcast." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching their son sleep, the warm, fragrant air of the conservatory enveloping them. The sounds of a happy, bustling castle drifted in through the open doors. It was a kingdom reborn, healed from the inside out. The wolfless Omega and the broken king had found each other in the dark and, together, had woven a new world from the threads of memory, courage, and a love that was strong enough to melt the frost of centuries and let the sun shine in.